Alrighty, so I think this was the first one that I had, and I believe that's the one that Jan marked as ready. Jan, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. So, there's this magic constant that for a maximum length of the array that the runtime can allocate. And, it's needed here and there in the collections when, if you want to make sure that the collection can grow to the maximum possible size or when we are growing buffers. And so far we have been, hard coding this magic constant all over the place. And it would be nice to have API for that so that you don't have to hard code it.
Who would use this aside from within the runtime itself?
Like whenever you are implementing, say, custom collection, and you want to make sure that the custom collection can grow to the maximum possible size that the underlying, say, array allows.
If your double and retry exceeds this number, clamp it to this number, and that's your last attempt.
Well, that clamping it to that number doesn't guarantee it will succeed. It just means that it's not guaranteed to
Well, it'll give it a chance, right? Because without this, you would just double and it would fail. And maybe it would have succeeded if it were slightly smaller than doubling it.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of scenario. Like if you are just doubling without flipping it to this number, you are basically reducing the maximum size to half of what's possible.
Yeah, this actually just came up a week or so ago, where Jan reactivated this because the implementation of array buffer writer would double, and then had a couple of issues with it. One, as soon as you hit 1 gig, it tries to double. It's gonna hit out of memory, so then you end up with kind of a poor utilization of memory because you try to double from 1 to 2 and you get out of memory. So then the algorithm previously tried to increment by a little bit. It didn't really know how much to ask for. So basically, I created a PR because it appeared to almost hang due to perf because it was constantly allocating memory as the buffer would grow. So this is just an implementation of array buffer writer that we have, but as Jan pointed out, others may want to do the same thing, and they just don't know what magic number to use.
Sure, but if you have 1 billion elements and you're clamping to a number close to 2 billion, you're probably going to cause some other part of the system to at some point, because almost certainly you're not going to use the additional 1 billion slots that you just allocated. It seems like a better solution would be, once you approach some threshold, instead of using 2 as your multiplicative factor, use 1.1 or something.
You still end up having the same issue though of, if I'm on a machine doing computing big data, it's entirely reasonable that I'm processing 2 gigs of data at a time. In which case,
so this number makes sense in 64-bit applications where you have enough memory to do that. But I guess what I'm afraid of is that if we expose this and then we tell libraries, oh, just double and clamp to this, there's going to be a significant number of scenarios where you actually haven't helped things at all. You're still just going to everywhere.
Right. It doesn't fix it solves the argument expression or argument exception or whatever it is that new array throws when you give it the number bigger than this.
New array doesn't throw argument exception at ooms.
We do have this magic number documented in the documentation, so it's not something that's internal implementation detail. It's just inconvenient to keep copying it.
Sure. I guess
the number is actually different on mono.
Yeah.
So
it's also different for array versus string versus other non-constant size data types. I guess I'm not opposed to exposing this in concept. I'm just afraid that if we do so, we're going to give people an incorrect view as to scenarios in which it should be used.
I mean, we don't do fancy logic beyond double for most of our implementations either. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong to just tell people that's the default thing to do, because all of our types do it.
Yes, but if we have scenarios where doubling actually causes problems, then we should change those. We should change that logic within the collection types that are experiencing that problem. And clamping to this number, I don't think would be the appropriate way to solve that issue within our collection types. I think the appropriate way would be to use a different growth factor.
Right, but again, this is the last number that will work, and if whatever algorithm you have produces this plus 1, you would need to back it off 1, right? Like I think it makes sense to add.
You would have to back it off 1 only if you're in a 64-bit operating system.
Everyone is in a 64-bit operating system.
I'm sorry, in a 64-bit application, and that's not necessarily correct. There are lots of applications, especially in shared hosters, that run 32-bit. In fact, that is
suggesting people do instead.
I'm suggesting that if you have a growth algorithm, you change your multiplicative ratio from 2 to 1.1 or something once you exceed some threshold. Okay, it would still be amortized O of n.
You've jumped more than one number, and that number could have been one that would have succeeded.
Sorry, say that again?
No matter what your growth ratio, unless it's plus 1, you will always have the potential to skip numbers that would have worked.
Correct. I guess what I'm saying is once you exceed a certain threshold, you should probably back off for fear of ooming the application.
I almost think
those
the
are two separate things. Like we should do both.
Yeah. I think the fact that someone might be writing an algorithm that fails on 32-bit apps because their growth factor is wrong is independent of whether or not we should expose an API that allows you to get the maximum allowed length of an array.
Correct, and I'm not opposed to exposing this. What I'm opposed to doing is exposing it and saying this is a scenario in which it should be used, because I think that will cause people to create fragile code.
I think it's fine to say every place in our code, which is more than I can count on one hand, where people hard code the value, and you can search customer code bases and the value is hard coded.
Yeah.
It is a step in the right direction to say use this API instead. If we want to then go a step further and say, well, your whole algorithm is wrong, and so is ours, by the way, let's fix it. That's an extra thing, but that doesn't replace having an API so people don't have to have a constant, which is even worse.
And it's not obvious, right, that you can't use int32.max value, right? It's just completely unintuitive. So if we have another constant on array of p, people understand that they just can't use max value.
Well, it can't be max value anyway, but yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. People don't know that it's not intuitive. So I mean, having a constant there that says it's not equal to max value, use this instead, I think is goodness.
I guess what I'm getting at is even in languages like C, max value is not the correct answer anyway. So if an application is written assuming that max value could be correct, they need to rethink how indices work on arrays.
Well, no, max value is still correct for length, but not as an index, which are two different things.
Correct. Yes, you're right.
And in this case, it's length rather than index. So you can also have, even though arrays in .NET Core can't be max length, spans, for example, can. I can allocate a native array that's that big.
Yep.
Have the length that and iterate successfully with a standard for loop.
Yes, you're right.
All right. So what I'm hearing then is the API is fine. It's just what we have to think about when we should use it, but that seems orthogonal.
Yeah, it does seem like a thing that might be good for the JIT to understand is a constant. Like when it does folding, maybe it'll do that automatically, but
yeah, it should just happen.
Excellent.
Question, should this be returning an int? I mean, I know for us int is reasonable, but we also have long.
If it's an SZ array, then int is correct.
Well, I mean, mono allows greater than 32-bit array lengths, right? Making this long would allow it to work everywhere.
How does it allow greater than 32-bit SZ array lengths? Like the length property is typed as system.int32.
Well, we have long length, right?
Yes,
but that's mostly for that's mostly for multi-dimensional arrays.
Yeah.
No, the long length is like that feature. Like it's basically like, it was designed in the early days of .NET Framework 1.0, but it kind of never materialized as something that works end to end. So, no.
I could be misremembering, but I feel like Mono supports greater than 32-bit array lengths.
That would be kind of strange if single-dimensional arrays had a length that large.
I also don't know how you would index into that, because I think like without changing C#, you would also have to have an indexer that accepts long, which I don't think is the case.
Arrays in IL support int32, long, uint, and others, and C# supports that as well.
Yeah, so you can in theory do tiny bit with arrays that are the long length arrays, but it basically doesn't work, right? It's like yes, you can allocate it and index into it, but you cannot reasonably pass it into any API and expect that API to work.
Right, because no code is written like this.
Well, can we, if we approve this, can we also provisionally say like, hey, check what Mono does and maybe adjust the return type or bring it back to the team?
I would almost think even if Mono does something different, then we should have a separate API of get max long length to match the length and long length.
I mean, honestly, I'm more with Jan. I would not bother. Like, I mean, the end-to-end doesn't work at all today. And unless there's an actual scenario where somebody has code that works this way on a platform that we care about, I would not invest in this. Just the fact that Mono has it, I don't think is good enough as a justification to add the complexity.
I agree.
All right, so then if there's no more, let's go to the next one, which I think is Jeffrey's API. Yep. Jeff, if you say anything, you're muted.
I can't see it. Did you bring it up?
Oh, is my thing frozen again?
Yep.
Of course it is.
Because things were going so smoothly.
What is happening here? Why is it? I guess this should work though.
Oh, is this the unsafe register API?
Yeah, the cancellation token.
Great.
Yeah, it seems like Teams again cannot handle sharing. So in that case, let me just copy paste this link into chat and accept the fact that screen sharing doesn't work. Oh, that's fun. Yeah, it seems like I cannot send IM messages either. So it's the second issue in the email. It's the 40475. I need my new computer. It arrives on Thursday, so next week we will have less problems.
So yeah, the feature here is we have existing APIs for cancellation token registration, register and unsafe register. The proposal here, what they take today is just an object and a state that you can pass in that'll be passed back to the callback. The proposal here is to add additional register and unsafe register APIs that also pass the cancellation token to your callback. Turns out that you almost always want access to the cancellation token because when you are getting called back on the registration, you probably want to generate a operation canceled exception, and you probably want to do it with the cancellation token that is causing the cancellation. And so what we do in several places in the code today is we have to store the cancellation token separately. So this is just a convenience thing. The impact on the code is, the implementation is pretty straightforward. It's a little tricky because we'll need to, test the type of callback that you've registered, whether it's the old action of object or the action of object and cancellation token in the new API, but that's a minor detail. Stephen looked at this, and I believe he is happy with it. And is he on the call today? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So that's the The only other thing to note here is that in the existing register APIs, we have an overload that has a bool use synchronization context argument. But per Stephen's feedback, this is not something we really want to encourage or that is common. So we did not add an overload with that additional argument to this new set of overloads.
What is the behavior if you call the one that doesn't take the bool?
As if the bool was false.
And that will be the same here for these, right?
Yeah. So we can always choose to add another overload that takes a bool in the future. And it's on the existing APIs. It's not an optional argument. It's just another overload. So this would be the exact same. I can count the number of times I've seen someone use it and set it to true on one hand. And I think in half those cases they shouldn't have been using it. So it's super, super, super rare. And it's one of those features I wish I could go back in time and remove.
Yeah, it seems reasonable then. Any other feedback on naming?
On naming the methods, you mean, or?
Well, anything. I mean, I'm just looking at parameters, but they all look
the
the same.
These all are basically exactly the same as the existing method names and parameter names. I think the only thing that isn't set in stone is the order of the arguments to the callback. And I suggested we do it this way so that it's kind of like overloads where there's one that just takes an object and there's one that adds a cancellation token after that. That also happens to map to our recommendation for methods taking cancellation token at the end. Although this is obviously for a slightly different purpose. But it just felt to me a little bit more natural. But if others wanted the other order, that would be okay too.
Well, totally. That seems totally reasonable to me.
Because it's this parameter logically, is that why it's natural at the front?
Yeah, well, naturally, I mean, that's actually another good reason, but because it often is sort of that. But the existing overloads just take action of object. So, whenever we add new overloads of methods, we always sort of think about adding parameters at the end rather than putting them before, so that when you graduate from one to the next, you're just adding things to the end. And so this is similar.
Just out of curiosity, what happens if you try using the cancellation token within the callback?
You can. The cancellation token will have already had cancellation requested. So
okay.
For the most part, things will be no ops. If you tried to register with it, it's just going to, it's just going to invoke whatever you pass to register. So you could kind of cause a Stack Overflow if you really wanted to. But that would be very strange.
You would notice that immediately in testing, yeah.
It would happen, and there's no non-determinism there. It would happen. Yeah. You would deterministically Stack Overflow.
Excellent.
So, is there one purpose to this of have the state, or is there two to have the state and to get the cancellation token back to do for comparisons?
So the primary purpose is to be able to use the cancellation token to as part of signaling cancellation of something. So like if you wanted to call some other task completion source set canceled, ideally you pass the cancellation token there so it kind of flows through. Or if you wanted to throw an operation canceled exception that contained, as Jeff was saying, you want to create an operation canceled exception, you want it to contain this token, you want to be able to say new operation canceled exception token. And without passing it in here, you have to find it some other way, which usually means storing the cancellation token on kind of what other object you have around, which might be the state, but often isn't, which means if you wanted to pass something as the state, you have to allocate something new to also pass it in. So Levi's point, a lot of uses of this are just this as the state. We did add you can get the cancellation token from the registration. However, and so what you can do is you can say, underscore registration equals register, storing the registration onto some field. But there's then a race condition where if cancellation happens to be requested before that store completes, then accessing the registrations token obviously won't work because it won't have been set yet.
Okay, and then for some reason APIs of .NET isn't working, and I foolishly had closed the tab because the existing one is action of object but doesn't take the state, right?
No, wait, what do you mean?
Well, is the existing signature action of object comma object or just action of object?
There is one action of object comma object.
Okay, I missed that it also took object. So this is just overloading just the callback.
Yeah, there is one that takes an action rather than an action of object.
Okay.
So, if we really wanted to be totally complete, we could have a system.action, another overload that took a system.action of cancellation or system action cancellation token. But if you care about passing in the token rather than closing over stuff, you probably also want to pass in the state.
That's fair. I was just trying to double check what the differences are and make sure that they both felt appropriate, but I had misremembered what it said. So,
cool.
Yeah, it all seems good to me.
Excellent. Then let's go to the next one, which I think this is probably Levi's. Actually, no.
Yeah, so can you share the issue?
Oh,
number?
sorry. So it's 42769. I think that's Jeremy's. Because you flipped it. I mean, I guess Levi filed it, but
it's also Levi's. So
Jeremy flipped it to ready for review.
So I missed it if you said it, Emo. We're stuck in Teams on the first issue.
It's 42769.
Yeah, I just posted a link in chat as well.
Yeah, I can't post the chat either. Like, I don't know what's going on with Teams.
That's fine. We can post those links. So basically, this is an API on random number generator that you give it an int and it returns a farm fresh byte array that contains that number of random bytes. It's an accelerator for allocate a byte array, call random number generator.fill over the byte array, and then return the byte array. It's basically an accelerator for 3 lines.
Yeah, it's just candy.
It's candy. The nice thing about it is that it allows you to use it as part of a constructor inline initializer, for instance. Because like, hey, inside of my inline field declaration, I can just call the accelerator rather than have to create a private function to have like temporary locals, blah, blah, blah. There were a few uses. There were a few call sites within the runtime and ASP.NET repos that could be rewritten in terms of this function.
It looks like a lot of the examples you gave are really small arrays. Like there's one example here that's just filling an 8-byte array. Mm-hmm. Do we have a span overload?
There is a span overload, yes. Yes.
Okay.
The thing about that is for most applications that just want to generate random data, I don't necessarily want to force those applications to understand the concept of span. And that's what all of our that's what the sample code that I had seen that originally led to this issue did. And I'm like, well, if we're trying to get people, if we're trying to teach people about like one particular facet of ASP.NET identity, for instance, I don't want to introduce span into the mix at the same time. So let's have a simple API to make that scenario easier, and then gradually they can use other things as time permits.
Definitely. I was just wondering if we already had an API or if there was potentially a missing proposal here to cover.
We have a good API for it, yeah.
Do we have any other overloads that it can take, like generate the random values in specific ranges?
Yeah, there's an API that returns a random value from some minimum to some maximum. It just returns a single integer. It doesn't fill an int array. It's used for things like fair dice rolls.
Right. So my question is, does it make sense to add to this one the ability to generate the values inside the array in specific range?
I don't know. The reason that I don't know is the scenarios that we had in mind were just choosing elements from a collection or rolling a die randomly. If you want to shuffle a collection, to permute a collection, for instance, to shuffle a collection, at that point you actually need to change the min and max values as you iterate through the returned array. So any API that just fills an array with randomly chosen values isn't going to fulfill that scenario. I probably explained that poorly.
No, I think I got what you're saying. The only thing is there's an existing API that says get non-zero bytes that basically fills a given byte array with non-zero bytes. Do we need that concept here, like get non-zero bytes with byte count?
No, that's a method that we would delete if we could.
Yeah, I actually have a separate API proposal to obsolete that or have an analyzer to kill it.
All right. Then I guess the answer to that question is no.
So I took Tarek's question slightly differently, of not necessarily shuffling an array, but for example, returning a byte array from 1 to 6, where all values in it are something between 1 and 6, rather than something between like 1 and 255.
Sure. At that point, are we talking byte array, int array, uint array, something else?
Right.
Yeah, but it feels pretty weird and like very niche. And should you be using the CSPRNG for that at all? And so,
I mean, I can think of scenarios for it, right? Like if you're implementing a game like Yahtzee, right, where you actually are rolling 5 dice at a time. Like,
I was about to say fair Yahtzee, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. It's just I don't know if we want to be that opinionated in whether we return byte or something else.
I mean, it seems
also,
like
should people be using the cryptographic API for implementing Yahtzee?
If you want it fair.
Sure.
If you're doing a gambling site based on Yahtzee, then yes.
Yeah.
I mean, my question for these things is more what I think Levi tried to express, which is if you have constraints on what the sizes are in the arrays, you're probably better off writing a for loop anyway and then call the int32 one, because chances are, like, you know, you have other constraints like, oh yeah, I can only have one number once or something like this, right? In which case you just run into this long tail now where you want to express all these constraints in a single method call.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that it's a combination of, like, it's complex and not common.
Yeah.
If it felt like there were common uses of, I need 100 random numbers between 100 and 107, then we could consider adding it. But I've not run across that in general usage. The random I want a fair random element out of an array was why we added the get int 32.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for adding array.shuffle, I guess, just not as part of this proposal.
I think we had a proposal for this, and I think we rejected it. I want to say.
For shuffling an array?
There was a shuffle one, yeah. I'm pretty sure we looked at this.
Probably because you'd want to pass an irandom into it so that you could test it or have repeatable results.
Well, that Jan wouldn't want that low of a level to depend on the crypto stack, because we need to invert the product. So
keep in mind also the APIs that we've been adding to this type lately are all static APIs rather than instance APIs, because we've basically told people don't bother subclassing this, just use the built-in implementation.
Right. Okay, anything else? Otherwise, this is it.
I mean, the only question to make sure that people consider is that get bytes is currently an instance method that fills an array, and this get bytes is a static method that returns an array. I don't think it's too complicated, but I don't know of a whole lot of other places that we have in one overload group a mix of static and instance.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even see that. Yeah, why is that a non-static? Because you said you don't want to deal with this subclassing thing?
Because there's no need for people to instantiate this thing. Like that, all usage of this type should just be RNG dot the method. That basically, it was, if we could redesign this type would just be a static class.
Yeah, I guess the question now is like we can't introduce statics for the other ones because they would conflict. So the best we could do is have a singleton of this guy, and you would say rng.instance.blah, in which case this guy wouldn't show up. Is that intentional then?
No, that you would just do rng.blah. We already have static APIs for everything that we've introduced recently. Like the fill method is static, for instance.
Yeah, and the get in 32 is static.
Oh, I see. We already have this mix. I thought this was the first one where we have something that is non-static. Okay, that is static. That's
it's the
fine.
first static method called get bytes. So we have existing instance get bytes, and this is static get bytes.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So your question is really within an overload group or within a method group.
Yes.
I'd say
I mean,
yes.
it's a fair question.
It's just you can't overload on those, so it's a bit shitty. But yeah.
Yeah, as long as nobody can think of a reason that's been a problem in the past or whatever.
I mean, the nice thing here is because the get by just calls the other ones who are non-static. Like there wouldn't be a scenario where we would ever want this to be non-static.
Right.
And that will be the only concern I have. But like, that seems fine.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that people realize that overload changed the staticity of the method.
Staticity. Nice. All right, so the next one, I think this is also Jeremy's. I think you flipped it at least.
Okay. What's the number?
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting this. 42906.
Okay. Right. So in .NET 3.5, whoever had my job at the time added 2 static members for well-known values of provider libraries for Windows CNG, and I don't know when they added the third one, but it's been there for a while, and this proposal was just add a static for the third well-known value. So this is really just, we're doing transparent interop. They've added another const. We're lifting it to a static.
Yeah, this saves you from having to define it yourself, right? You can just use the built-in one. As in, the workaround today is new CNG provider of ms underscore blah, 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 right?
Yeah. Yeah, the CNG provider is just a strongly typed string.
Yeah.
I always forget, Jeremy, is CNG the one we like or the one that's sort of deprecated?
It's the newer one.
Okay.
CNG is the gooder one. It's the one that everything nowadays is based off of.
It's the one we hate less, I think.
Generation.
I was gonna say, I don't know that we like either of them. They have different problems.
CSP is the badder one?
CSP is the worst one, yes.
Okay.
CSP was NT3 and CNG was Vista.
Okay.
I see. But all the bad APIs you put in system security cryptography, right? That's still fair.
I mean, if you want to say that all the bad APIs in .NET are in system security cryptography, I can't think of contrary ones on the top.
They're legacy. Legacy gives it a certain air of respectability.
They're ease of use challenged.
Yes.
Ease of use challenged.
The API makes sense to me.
Yeah, it seems.
Yeah.
Let me just remove the noise here to make it clear what we actually did. All right. So, cool. That was fast. Another crypto one. 42763.
This is the get non-zero bytes one. I've actually been offline for a few days, so I don't know if there was other extra discussion on here.
So basically, you said earlier we don't like the API, so this is basically just saying don't use it. But why would we not just mark it obsolete?
So, yeah, there's this is something that I know Stephen and I have talked about on this issue before, which is I guess I see. I get nervous about marking things as obsolete if we're never actually going to remove it ever. But I guess Steve's argument, which is a totally valid argument, is, you know, if we just have an analyzer saying you probably don't mean to use this, is it effectively different from obsoleting it? And the answer, I think, is no.
I would honestly say the user experience is 100% identical, because whatever diagnostic ID you would give the analyzer, you would put the obsolete attribute, so that it would read exactly the same way in the output.
Yeah, I think the difference would be if we felt that the analyzer should not be on by default.
Well, I think there is a difference. If something is marked obsolete, my assumption would be that it might be removed at some later time, so I should just not use it even if I do need it. An analyzer doesn't tell me that.
That is true, although I don't know, actually, that I'm thinking about this, I don't even think the off by default is a problem, because we have editor config where we could do that, right? We have one that is for the product that we could say by default, we say this one is informational, right? I think the general idea of analyzers is that, to me, the difference between obsolete and analyzer is really more about the detection itself. Like, do you need custom code to do a better detection? Like, do you have to inspect the arguments? Do you have to see what people do with the return value, stuff like that, right? If it's just blatantly, this API is bad, don't use it, I see zero reason why we would write code for that if we could just put an attribute on it, because it does exactly the same thing. Whether we kill the API ever, to me, is completely orthogonal, right? Because the intent in both cases is the same. You want to inform the user that they really shouldn't call the API. And in some cases, the replacement exists, but, you know, it's nuanced. In some places, there is no replacement. And that's fine, right? Whether we remove the API, I think, is, again, completely separate from this, because there might be reasons why we can't.
Yeah, and I think it's actually good to look at the problem this way, right? If you back up and ask, like, what's the actual problem we're trying to solve? The problem we're trying to solve is I would like to provide a better experience to people who write calls to this API to tell them, hey, just double check to make sure that you actually meant this, because you almost certainly meant something else instead. That's really the only experience I'm going for. However we achieve that experience, I'm completely open to ideas.
So let me get this right. So basically, so what is wrong with me calling get non-zero bytes when I could handle 0 bytes in principle? Is it just the API is more expensive to call, or, I mean, I don't see
random bias. You are removing the amount of entropy in the call, which means that your overall security posture is less than you believed it was.
So I'm not a crypto guy, but like intuitively, I would assume it just means I remove one possible value from 256, and that's sufficient.
That's probably sufficient for Niels to break your code. I mean, basically, it's instead of getting 8 bits of randomness per byte, you're getting 7.5. And so you end up with a lot less random than you think you have. And if you're working with small numbers, that becomes a problem.
It would open you. It would potentially make your application fail a security audit.
How is that any different than the get an int32 between min and max range?
Sorry?
We were just discussing how there's also an API that gets you an int32 between a minimum and maximum value. How is that secure while this one is insecure?
Because you're doing it once and it's very clear what you're trying to do, as opposed to you're filling a buffer and you probably didn't mean to call this method.
So if you're specifying a lower and an upper bound while you're generating a random number, then that means that you're basically trying to choose an element from a set. Like that's basically the scenario for it. Get non-zero bytes basically means give me random data except for remove some entropy from the random data, which there are vanishingly few scenarios where that's actually what you had intended to do. If you're getting random data, chances are you're using it to make a cryptographic key, a nonce, something along those lines. All cryptographic protocols should be able to support 0 just fine.
Should this be addressed in the documentation more than and the IntelliSense more than just forcing something here? I mean, I can think about some scenarios that people will need that still.
How do you know to read the documentation?
IntelliSense can help, right?
On this.
Sorry, what was that, Steve?
Editor browser false attribute.
We tend not to do that except for stuff that only the compiler is responsible for calling.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure what the guidelines is for that anymore.
I mean, we can always change the guidelines. It's just that's historically the stance that's been taken.
I mean, I would be okay. So basically, I think what you're saying, Levi, is that this API is really meant for generating secrets, right? Because you're basically giving it a buffer and it fills it, right? And there's very few cases where that secret must not contain zeros, right? And so with that logic in mind, I think you can say, given that almost all usage of this API is probably wrong, I'd be okay with saying it's an analyzer that's on by default and the one person that has to deal with the fact that it can't handle nulls while they suppress that instance. Everybody else gets a warning. I think that seems reasonable. Like if it's more like, well, half the people need it, the other half doesn't, then, well, it's a decision you have to make. But I think then a warning is not the right way to force people to make a decision, because basically people will usually just do whatever the warning tells them to do, right? And if that's the wrong thing, half the time that's also not the best thing to do.
Doesn't it the API name itself telling you that? I mean, like it says get non-zero bytes. I mean, like it's telling you the purpose of this. I mean, what is wrong with that?
I think to just echo them, right? Like, because I mean, I had the same initial reaction that you have, Tarek, but like, I think it's fair to say if you generate a secret in a buffer, like you probably want maximum entropy, right? And the fact that within 7 bits you remove like half a bit or whatever the actual math is probably not great. And so you might actually do something way more insecure than you're aware of, right? So if you would have named the method get non-zero bytes less secure, maybe that would be less of an issue, right? But get non-zero bytes seems very harmless.
Like there are 4 calls to this method inside .NET Framework. 3 of them are bugs.
So 75% of our usage is wrong. That's pretty good.
Correct. And the one usage is in the same assembly, so it could have not made this a public member. And that one usage we've removed in core. So,
I mean, here's another question: if we could make breaking changes, would we remove the API? Because if the answer is yes, then I think obsoleting by default seems reasonable.
I wouldn't necessarily remove it, because like there might be a scenario in which it's what you intended, but that scenario would absolutely be an outlier.
Going a step further, would we have added, if Jeremy alluded to his predecessor, if it was up to us now and this API didn't exist, would we add it?
I would say no. It's so specialized, I don't think we would add it.
Yeah, I'm trying to look. I think we left it out of .NET Core 1. It only came back as part of the API unification in 2. Like, we made the decision to remove it back when we could remove things.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we had that conversation on this API.
But just like his sharing in Teams, Emo's website is not working.
What data do we have? How often is this method used?
I don't know. Let's ask APIs of .NET.
It's because we're all DOSing the site right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it works for me.
It has to do a whole lot of work. Well, great. Tell us what the usage is. And whether or not we had it in .NET Core 1.
So it is the. Of course, I already closed the tab again because I'm bad like this. So getting on 0 bytes that takes a byte array is used by 7 point something %. And it exists in .NET Core since 2.0. So it came back as part of our compat push. And then the span one, I think we added in 2.1 probably, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is every single one of them is a bug.
That's what my gut tells me too.
I know I've only seen one place where using cryptographic random data called for having non-zero values, and that is the one place that was a legitimate call in framework, but we replaced it with just calling into the OS functions in core.
Yeah, so if you look at API port, which is kind of like the subset of API port that is effectively some selected customers, which are the, component vendors and some first party that are that we looked at some point, it's 37%. But I'm inclined to agree with you that it seems like I can't think of a single scenario where that's actually needed, because even if you generate strings, I would not use that method because you have unintelligible strings anyway. And if I hex encode them, then I also don't care. So I don't know why people would not like 0 bytes in there.
So if you're using it to generate strings, you're actually removing half of the entropy, not 0.5% of the entropy. So have fun with that.
Because you basically have to remove everything that's below like 32 or something.
No, because what will happen is you'll end up generating invalid UTF-8, and the framework normalizes it to a single constant replacement character when it sees any invalid sequence.
Yeah.
So literally half the data that you generate is going to be invalid and will be replaced with a single thing in the end after transformation.
I mean, the question really is like, if you look at these 37%, right, are they using any sort of, I guess... I mean, it doesn't seem to me like they're using cryptographic things, right? They're probably not generating secrets. Right? They're probably doing something, random, right? Which is kind of like at this point, they probably don't care that they reduce the entropy. But I honestly don't know what you use this API for. I mean, if you don't generate a secret, I don't know what you use it for. But I have a hard time believing that 40% of API port first parties generate secrets. I mean, I don't know what they would do. It seems also far-fetched. So they must be doing something. I don't know whether it's, I can just guess random stuff, like they generate a color or something, right? And they just happen to do a byte array with, whatever byte size they need for a color struct, right?
So maybe what we can do then is it looks like maybe we have some follow-up items in chat, and we can just follow up with those, figure out what the impact of the ecosystem will be, and then just mark this as needs work. Does that seem reasonable? I
mean, that seems reasonable to me. I mean, I would even say, like, to me, it would be reasonable to say we obsolete it, and then if we think that is only relevant for security-related audits, we could figure out whether we can put it in the editor config by default and turn it off. And then this way, it would just basically bring it in if somebody enables the security rules, right? That should work because we have custom IDs now.
Yep.
True.
Yeah, so I think based on the descriptions of stuff, I would go with Steve's suggestion of obsolete it instead of make an analyzer for it. Just to give him credit as the first one to say it on the issue.
I'm just going to start trolling all the issues and just saying obsolete. No, I got lots of credit.
Sounds great to me.
Well, statistically, you must be right at some point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, just diff .NET Core 1.1 and .NET Core 2 and obsolete everything that's in the Delta.
Right.
Everyone will be happy with that decision. basically it looks like, I started doing a search for get non-zero bytes, and the suggestion was get non-zero bytes versus get bytes, and I don't understand. Why are there two? Why are zeros bad? Obviously, I should call the one with more words in it.
Zero is bad because if you divide by zero, you'll get exception. Right?
To be honest, I have a feeling it was created because there were people passing it in through interop into native code, and the zero null byte would indicate end of data.
I think they did it just for the PKCS1 encryption padding. They had it as a public class, and they're like, this is a utility function we need. Obviously, everyone needs it, but PKCS1 padding is the only thing that needs this. Since it's a zero terminated buffer. But they're aware they have a 62-bit. There are 62 bits of entropy instead of 64, or whatever the math actually works out to be.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see how people use this API for. I have a hard time believing that they all generate secrets. That seems far-fetched. So then I marked this as needs more work. I posted in the comments that we had. Fix my markdown issues, otherwise my tool will not be happy later. Anything else? I guess no. All right. So then let's look at 42706.
This is mine.
I was about to say that sounds like a Tarek issue.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a proposed API in the activity class in the system diagnostics, and this API we call it set baggage. So this is the same idea what we have done in 5 release when we added similar API for the tags. So in activity class we have tags and we have packages, and both of them is a similar idea. It's just key value pairs. I mean list. The difference between tags and baggage is baggage is intended to be transferred through the wire. I mean across the process. So it's similar idea. So to give some more idea about like in tags, for example, about like in 5, before 5 we had the APIs called add tags, which is always add a tag, even if you have in the list same key that you are going to add. So the list can end up with multiple items with the same key. Mm-hmm. So and we said that some people want to use some other API or to have a way that they can guarantee overriding the old key instead of adding new key. And in 5, we decided to introduce APIs called set tag, which is it will guarantee about like if you have this old key in the list before, so it will override this one instead of adding new one. So set baggage is exactly similar idea here. So it's just like we already have also add baggage. So add baggage is always adding baggage, and we cannot change this behavior because of the compatibility. But set package is going to have the logic about like if you have this old key, if you have this key in the list before, so the new value will override the old value there.
So a quick question.
This makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the API makes sense considering the other one. I just wonder why we do baggage and tags. Like, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, as I mentioned, about baggage is intended to be transferred across the wire. I mean, it's kind of, think about it about like, the state that it can transfer from one end to other end. But tags is intended to be contained inside the process. It's not intended to be exposed outside the process.
I see. Then it seems reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally confusing to people when we have both add and set, but
yeah,
we've had it elsewhere.
I
So.
agree with that. I mean, but this is the only solution we got in 5 for tags at least.
Yeah, I mean, I guess are there good reasons to still call add, or should it also be marked obsolete?
Still good reason to leave it. I mean, like, maybe we can, I mean, like, some people depend about like adding multiple items with the same key. It's good. I mean, it's okay for them. I mean, I wouldn't go and obsolete add from now. I mean, except if I see evidence about like this is really messing up with some people.
So what happens when you call add with the same key? It just appends to the list of values, right?
Yeah, it's just appended. Yeah.
So it wouldn't throw. So
yeah,
it goes on to then say the behavior is then undefined from that point on.
Well, why would it be undefined? It would just mean that you have
because when you serialize it into something else, which one does it see for that value? It went across the wire with 2 values for the same key. You're now in do they read the first one or the last one?
Oh,
well,
it
sounds like it sounds like from the issue description they are ordered. Isn't that correct, Eric?
Say it again. Sorry, I didn't hear
it. From the issue description that you had listed on GitHub, it sounds like baggage is ordered. So get will always return the first thing that was added or the thing that was overridden.
So the list of the package is stored in the first in, last out. So last item you add, this is the first one you will get. So this is the order of the package. And actually people depend on this order today.
Right, but it says in the issue that something in ASP.NET Core that causes a transfer, because it read it out as a stack, when it's now loaded it into a new one, the one that used to be last is now first, and the one that used to be first is now last. So it changes what the API returns every time you send this thing across the wire.
There's an ASP.NET workaround to fix that.
ASP.NET already have a fix for that, and they are porting this fix to surfacing to ensure that all the time they will get the exact same order, even if transferred through the wire.
I'm just like, it just seems like what it's saying is at that point you're in a very not well-defined behavior, because it depends on who you're sending the message to and how they handle duplicate keys. Do they guarantee that they're going to read them in the same order? What's the serialization order going to be? Which actually means they need to read them in the reverse order. Like it just feels very iffy, and so it seems weird to me that we would say, yeah, sometimes maybe you're depending on this, and therefore we're not going to mark it obsolete, versus mark it obsolete and say stop depending on this order and just make it there only be one.
Okay, so
that's
just to clarify about, like, as I mentioned about internally for us, we are storing it in the last in, first out, and when it's transferred on the wire, it will be transferred on same order. So the last one, first out. And if somebody reading it from the wire, they understand this is the order, and it's up to them to handle this order. So the behavior is well defined, but how people is going to handle it, it's a different issue.
But basically what you're saying is the behavior is well defined. It's just ASP.NET has a bug that makes it ill defined, but they're fixing that.
Yeah, but ASP.NET is fixing it.
Right.
I need to jump to a different meeting.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I'm hearing then is, like, there's no reason not to expose this API or obsolete the other one. It just means people have to know what they're doing. But that's already the problem today, right? We're not really making it worse. We're just saying, no, it's an easier way to just replace the thing.
Yeah.
Is there no remove? Is it only because you only have add and set, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the APIs that we exposed for set tag, it include also the remove if you pass null value. So if you want to remove any item from the list, you will pass null value for it when you're calling set API.
Is that how tags work as well?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is the behavior we went with because this is what recommended by the OpenTelemetry specification. They saying that if you have, they call it attribute instead of tags there. So they saying that if you're passing null value, this means that you want to remove this item instead of adding item with null value. Because like they are saying that if you don't have the item in the list, it's exactly the same if you have the item with the null value. It's the same behavior for them.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so that means yeah, I was just looking at the implementation because API of .NET is not updated for some reason. So I didn't see the set tag one, but it's there.
You want me to send you a link or?
Yeah, I just saw it in source of .NET. It's fine. All right, so then, so that was that. One more thing. This is Carlos's one, I believe, if he's on the call. This would be 42710. Is Carlos on the call, or can somebody represent this? Otherwise, we should probably skip it.
So I'm guessing this API is to open a named mutex or something in Windows, right? I don't know if Linux has the same feature set there.
It's the same issue we have in other places though, right? We already have, if you pass in a non-empty or non-null value for name, that certain APIs already fail on Linux. So that wouldn't make it worse. It would just, you know, it's a different entry point where the same problem exists, right?
Yeah, I mean, these classes are kind of sort of Windows-ish anyway.
Well, I think they're pretty much Windows exclusive, right? Because they all tag eccles. I don't think they work at all on Linux.
Oh, these are for an ACL class. Okay.
So, I mean, we don't really port the existing API as much as we provide alternatives for the existing API. Right, because we added these echo types, so we don't have to add them on the actual semaphore mutex and event wait handle.
Yeah, that's fair.
But let me take a quick look because event handle.
Yeah, Carlos is oof today, by the way. I just saw that message come across.
Yeah, he's listed green, which is funny.
That might be my doing. I was chatting with him without realizing he was out of office.
Yeah, so basically we have an existing one that exists directly on event wait handle, right? That is open existing, that takes a name and the event handle rights. And so this one we don't have. We do have the overload that doesn't take the event handle rights. And that is in net standard since 1.0. And this one basically fails on Linux if you don't have a name. Oh, sorry, this always fails because you require a name. But this seems to be the pattern, right? We basically decided that we have these ECL APIs, or these ECL types, so that would be the pattern, right?
Yeah, I think the API makes sense to me. I don't know about the mutex rights and semaphore rights types.
Yeah, I mean, they are effectively just the very convoluted representation of the Windows echoes. So yeah, there's not much more to it than that. They are about as usable as you think they are. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate we went with this pattern, but like it's the pattern that we have. So I think the APIs look fine to me.
All right, what pattern would you wish we did instead?
Well, the problem really is I wish we would not have bifurcated the types. Because we didn't do this in other areas. So we only did it for these things because of layering, right? Like in many other cases, we just expose the actual APIs on the actual type and then just say, yep, it's a Windows-specific API. But here's an area where we basically broke it into a separate set of types. So if you come from .NET Framework, adding these APIs doesn't make more code work. You still have to call a different API in order to move to core. That's the unfortunate side of it.
Fair enough. I didn't think we had anything that we had exposed the ACL APIs directly, but yeah, maybe it's just because this is the only thing that has that inverted dependency. It may have even been a circular dependency. It may have required rebuilding MS Corelib.
Yeah, I think we looked into this and we concluded we couldn't do it because I'm pretty sure we had this discussion last time with Carlos and we all said that's sad, but it's the way it is.
Yeah.
All right, so then...
Yeah, it looks like it follows the pattern. So
the only call that I have, I know the open mutex function, it has a parameter for inheriting, like sub-processes inheriting the handle. I don't know if that's something anyone would care about here.
Where do you see this in the API reflected?
It's not. There's if you look at open mutex, there's an inherit handle boolean, and it's on there for semaphore as well, and event. Okay.
In the CTORs.
Yeah, I mean, like this is just the port of the static API, right? So the static API has whatever the behavior of static API on .NET Framework is. I think that's what these things would do, right? So they would be very straight ports. They just happen to be on a different type.
Yeah, I feel like those booleans are
like,
controlling the creation of the mutex, which means they don't apply when opening it.
Yeah.
No, these do apply when opening it. These are basically just wrapping the open mutex, open semaphore, open event APIs for Windows.
Sorry, which inheritance are you talking about? Because there's only one bool, and that is for create new versus open existing.
I'm talking about the Windows C API.
Oh,
that's
there's a Boolean inherit handle parameter. And I'm curious what these APIs would set that bool to. I guess whatever framework had.
Yes.
Yep.
And maybe to avoid adding more APIs in the future, we expose that bool here.
But this is just porting existing methods from framework.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Whatever behavior they have, that's the one we would give them. To be honest, I don't even understand what try open existing does if you pass in mutex rights.
I think that's if you pass in that you want to set it instead of just read it, and you don't have that permission, it returns false. Or if it doesn't exist, I think.
Like opening a file, you specify what rights you need to that handle.
Oh, so I see. So the mutex could have some set of rights, and then I can say, well, my handle should only have a subset of those.
Yeah.
I see. Well, okay, so it seems reasonable then.
Yeah, it's fine.
All right, I think this
looks
is
like inherit handle's just false.
Gee, you're fast. So this is, I think, Steve Harder's 42755.
So this is basically around the JSON document class that we have, which is essentially a buffer of the JSON, and then from that document you get these element classes or structs. And it implements, the document implements iDispose. However, in at least the serializer cases, and probably other people as well, the dispose semantics aren't necessary, and we don't want them because we want to return a standalone element that people don't have to worry about calling dispose on, because it'll be like the return value from a property, for example. In either case, there was a clone method that was added when we did the initial support for this class, and the serializer uses that as a workaround. And there's a couple issues with that. One, the main reason is it's slow. I found that it can be optimized, and this particular area of the serializer is actually very slow, so we can make it a lot faster. And then the second reason is calling this clone method on the document to get a standalone element is just not very obvious. So it probably, for those people that need to use this, it probably makes their life a little easier. So the proposal had these two methods.
So I guess because it's not disposable, it just means you allocate the memory on the GC heap then, right?
Yeah. And which clone will ultimately do, it'll convert the pooled memory, or release the pooled memory and do a GC-alloc, and but now we allocated, in some cases anyway, an extra buffer where we didn't need to.
Right. I mean, that seems reasonable to me. I'm not sure what Jeremy thinks about this, given that he wrote it originally.
I mean, I can see the value. I could also see it being non-public. That's just an implementation detail of the serializer, but I do feel like the uses that we've seen, like we wrote JSON document with a certain set of goals, and I think that none of our users cared about those goals, and that really it's just an array pool thief, basically, and using this method, using the one on JSON element, it means that you're not being an array pool thief. So it's probably an easier semantic to deal with, and I agree with start small, and we can build our way up to having all the parse overloads if people ask.
So say that try parse value returns false. Is the state of the UTF-8 JSON reader mutated?
Nope.
Okay.
I mean, it's not for document. I assume that Steve's implementation doesn't have it as modifying it for this.
Yeah, I didn't actually prototype that method, but I do know we make a backup of the reader state, and if there's an exception or something, that is restored.
Okay.
The one handy thing about the mutable struct is you can just copy it to a local, and then on exception, just reassign the ref. It has built-in unwind.
So one question I have is, so the other overloads on JSON document, what would they even mean for JSON element?
It's basically be JSON document without the array pool.
Yeah, JSON document has a root element. So this is honestly, it's just returning the root element from JSON document, but making sure it's standalone in terms of memory.
I see. Yeah, so the reason I'm asking is, so if you, I guess the problem exists in both places, never mind. I was just wondering if you have, because parse kind of implies that the return value matches the type you're invoking it on. So JSON document.parse gives you a JSON document, but I guess that would be the same here, right? JSON element.parse will give you JSON element.
Yep.
And then the parse value is just specific for the constraint on what this root element could be, right?
Right. We made parse and parse value different on JSON document because parse will fail if it does not see exactly one JSON value, because it's supposed to be the entire document.
Right.
And a document can only be one value. Versus parse value, which is you can be in the middle of a reader and it starts wherever this is and goes until it ends and doesn't care if there's remaining data. So, I mean, really, it's
I see.
Parse value and parse value, or parse value with a Boolean of don't throw. But
yeah,
since we say don't throw, we have parse value.
I see. That's what you're saying, basically. So parse value is more powerful than parse in the sense that it just doesn't throw. The other one would throw.
Parse value has different error handling.
Yeah.
Depending on what you're trying, like if the notion of you've called file.open and then say JSON document.parse, it's like you think that this is one JSON file and you probably didn't expect that it was a value and then a comma and then something else, because what does that even mean to you? Versus parse value is you own the reader, you can see that the reader's not terminated.
Yep, that makes sense to me.
So.
All right, then. I guess that's approved.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just close. So we have 2 left. 508.
Like a 3-digit number?
Yeah. That was before we copied the other issues over.
This is me.
Okay.
Basically, we have methods today for converting a vector of t to another vector type. For example, byte, sbyte, any of the 10 supported primitives. However, we don't have a generic implementation of this method. So it is, if you want to convert from a generic vector of t to another generic vector of t, you currently have to write your own logic handling all 10 if statements. For the newer vector types, such as vector 64, 128, and 256, we do have this generic overload and had previously discussed it, the benefits, the drawbacks, and ultimately approved it. So this is just saying we should expose a similar generic t from t2 method for system numerics vector of t.
It seems like a no-brainer. Is this an omission that we didn't have it, or?
Well, it's likely something that was just missed or not considered when it was initially implemented back in 2014.
I mean, it also has the problem of it's not really generic. It understands 10 types, and
12 types now, actually.
Oh, sorry. You said 10 earlier. I just parroted you.
Yeah.
And so, we probably would have had a hesitation on that. But if we've already added one thing to vector that has the switch-a-fall, then it seems fine.
I mean, vector always had both, right? Because some methods would work for every t. So we had apps of t, for example. And there's some where we constrained it because you only wanted to expose certain operations for certain combinations of types. But this seems like, well, if all inputs and outputs are legal, then it seems like we should have had the generic method from day one.
Yeah, it will still throw, of course, if you try and do like vector of bool, because vector of bool is just not supported.
Right.
But for any of the
you're not
types,
expanding the set of types that are supported. You're just saying for the set of types that is supported, you can just write it as t.
Right.
And there's no failing, right? They all work, right? No matter what combinations I use.
Right, because this is effectively just a reinterpret cast of the underlying bits.
Right.
I mean, depending on the question you're asking, Emo, they don't all work. There are 12 types that can be the from and 12 types that can be the to. And any other type will cause an exception.
Yeah, I'm saying within those 12 types, every combination of calls would work.
So you could go from like float to int. That's still fine.
Yeah.
Yep. Or from
across the platforms.
Yes, because it's just reinterpret casting the bits.
Okay.
Is changing size legal? Like a vector of byte to a vector of short?
Yes, because all vector of t is fixed width. It's fixed number of bytes no matter what the underlying type is. So a vector of int will be 32 bytes and have 8 elements, while a vector of byte will have 32 elements.
Right.
Okay.
So the vector length will change, but it will.
Okay. Because span we have the convert, but it throws if you would make a size, or if the sizes can't be adjusted. But if this is, yep.
Yeah,
it seems fine.
The only thing I would say is like make sure you run it by Carol because she might have been the person telling us not to do that.
Yeah, I can ping her again and make sure, but I don't believe she had pushback against it when we added 64, 128, and 256. So I don't think there would be pushback here either.
Yeah, I hope not. I was just because it seems like such a glaring omission that I'm almost confident we proposed it and it didn't happen at the time.
One of the things that was discussed with the intrinsic vector types was namely that we don't expect many people to be writing generic code, and then there was a lot of people that were saying this makes it super difficult for the cases where you are wanting to write generic code. Please add it, and we ultimately relented.
Right.
Because people apparently love writing generic code that calls generics with fixed types.
Yes. All right, so then last one is, I think, 40202.
Yep. I realized I never muted myself on my clicky keyboard. Sorry. So this is an API that, given a char star or a byte star, will create a span around that char star or byte star, assuming that the buffer the pointer points to is null terminated. There was a proposal to just get the length. Sorry, one sec. Where was this? No, so sorry. I'm resetting my mind here. There was a proposal. It was approved. It was kicked back. Why was it kicked back? Is it because we didn't want to expose Nuent? Oh yeah, okay, got it. So what we had originally approved a few months ago were two sets of APIs. The first set of APIs took a char pointer and a byte pointer, and assuming that those buffers were null terminated, returned a span wrapping the buffers. The second set of APIs took a char pointer or a byte pointer and returned the length as a nuint of that buffer, assuming null termination, without actually creating the span. The reason that we had proposed both APIs is because spans can't handle buffers greater than int32.max value. So by returning a nuint, we would be able to give you an answer regardless of how long the underlying buffer actually was, since at this point we're dealing with raw pointers. There was some pushback against that, basically saying that, hey, do we actually need to take or return nuint? Is there even a scenario for this, or should we return a different size like a long? Did I represent your argument correctly, Steve? I think you're still on the call.
Sorry, I was getting lunch. I just came back.
This is the API where, given a char star or a byte star, we return the length of the null terminated buffer to you as a nuint.
Yeah.
And there's a sister API that just gives you back the span directly. There was, I believe, concern that maybe we didn't need the API that returned the nuint to you. We only needed the API that returned the span to you, and you could get the int from the span. The scenario that eliminates is the ability to receive the length of a buffer that's greater than int32.max value. But maybe we just add that API when we get support for large span.
I think we add that when we get support. This was actually Jan's feedback.
Yeah.
Mine was around the name.
The name create from null terminated?
Yeah, that we have other APIs that take pointers that don't say null terminated in the name because there's only one logical conclusion for what it could be doing. So why say it?
I see.
Because
So
that's on like string, where you understand what char star to string would mean. This is memory marshal.
Sure.
So it'd just be memory marshal.create char star, which
create span char star. Yeah.
Create span. Yeah. It would be an overload to the existing create span method.
Exactly.
Would we do create read only span as well then?
Sure.
Actually, I guess it would only make sense to do read only span, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, if it's char star, it could be to mutable memory.
Yeah,
True. Yeah.
I would generally assume that a char star is mutable. I would expect one of the largest use cases of this is going to be interop code, where it likely is mutable by default.
I agree that in interop code it would be mutable, but would you be pointing to a buffer that is already populated with some data plus a null terminator in order to overwrite it, but not move where the null terminator is?
Potentially.
Getting a value back from Win32, you want to replace the second letter.
Yep. And if we return span, it will implicitly convert except in F# to read-only span.
True. I'm just thinking back to my own p-invoke scenarios where I'm often changing the length of a string. So when I call into p-invoke, I'm giving it a buffer, which might just have arbitrary null bytes or null characters everywhere. At which point create span would be the wrong thing to do.
But then I mean, this is for the advanced case. If you know the length, you're just going to say new span pointer length, right?
Yeah. If you know the length, yeah.
There's also a case that's common in, particularly in the Win32 COM APIs, where there will be a fixed size buffer as part of a struct, where it is null terminated but has a maximum potential length. So you might know that the buffer has 128 bytes of space that you can fill in, and you can just freely overwrite from the existing data and insert the new null termination character without having to resize.
Yes, but this API assumes that not a single one of those existing chars is null. Because as soon as it hits any null character, even before the full buffer has been exhausted, it terminates the span right there on the spot.
Right, which is the intended use case for those scenarios. You have something that's at most 128 bytes and null terminated.
So then we would at most 128 bytes and null terminated. So you don't have to pass in a maximum length here.
Technically, no.
Okay.
Not for that scenario. Although, as a general safety precaution, I think it's still best practice to do so, just in case someone puts invalid data and you want to avoid a buffer overrun.
So that implies that we would want overloads that basically mimic like Sterling S.
Well, that was the punted proposal.
Not just
or the question.
As a parameter.
So, sorry, say that again, Corey.
At that point, we should just pass in a span as a parameter and not a pointer. If there's some maximum length to search by.
Correct. If you know if you already know that the maximum length is valid to dereference, you could just create the span around that entire buffer. What would be invalid is to create a span around a pointer with, say, int.max value as a length, and then to look for the null terminator inside of that. We make no guarantees that will work.
I think we would need both. We would need both the pointer overload and the span overload.
But the span one's just called find 0.
Yeah, it's just span.index of 0 and split on that.
Yeah.
That's true. But, I mean, this is already a convenience method over a 2-line thing, so
This is not a convenience method. This method's actually pretty difficult to write on your own in a high performance fashion.
Although we're just going to initially implement it as int.maxValue and find index of, right?
Yeah, but we can do that because we're the runtime and we have knowledge
Yeah.
about how memory is laid out.
Yeah.
But it would be invalid for any third party to do that.
Right.
So
The
just
other option,
dropped it
the
straight
other
to
option is
Sterling.
what we talked about, I think, maybe earlier in this issue. I don't have it in front of me, and that is you just expose a find null terminator, and then you can give it a char star find null terminator, and then you can use that from your own new span method, your own new span usage.
So it returns a char star or a byte star?
Returns a length.
So this is
I see.
that you want the buffer.getString length, you just want to change new ints to ints.
Yeah, and then only expose that.
So not expose the span version, only expose the get length version.
Right, I'm suggesting that's an alternative. Effectively, you're exposing the primitive, the building block. Someone else can write it, the consuming code in one line, and you can use, if all you wanted was the length, you can just call that function that gives you the length.
I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but like, if I write unsafe code, why is that so hard to write? I mean, I understand that you don't want to create a span over that pointer, but why isn't it just a while loop?
It's a while loop, it's just not performant, that's all.
Yeah,
We can do
Oh,
it
I
far
see.
faster than you can.
I see.
Vectorization and various tricks that we use in span internally already. The only thing I don't like about returning the string length is I know that I will be outvoted on wanting to return native int, and I think that it's pointless to restrict that scenario when native int is completely valid for an arbitrary chart pointer.
Well, that was the original accepted proposal. It returned new int, but that's one of the things that's causing issue.
Right. In which case, I think just the create span from null terminated is the essentially the median between those, and doesn't take up an API that I would believe is better suited to return native int.
So that one of the things now is if we return a span, or if we return int, now we have to consider failure cases where the original API did not have to consider that. Because if we're returning a new int, we're never ever going to fail. Like, we might crash the process, but we'll never fail.
Sorry, what is the case?
Sorry, Levi, say that again.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to return a new int, not just for what Tanner said, but also that this method that returns a new int by definition can never fail. It might crash the process, but it can never fail.
Which method that returns a new int? The get length is the one that returns the two.
Get length that returns a new int has 0 failure cases. If it returns a correct answer.
Sure.
Or it does not return at all. And by not return at all, I mean your process dies.
Yeah.
Because you've AV'd.
Sure.
I mean, that's
So now we have to consider failure cases if we restrict that to just returning an int.
Sure.
I mean, really, it just means that the one that doesn't take a maximum length calls the other one with a maximum length. And yes, we have to decide, will it always return get max array length of t, or will it, say like, well, I hit the end of my search space and didn't find it, but I think we would just call it with what's the maximum legal index. And now we don't guarantee that we found a null if you call this one. We tell you either as far as we're allowed to search or where the null was.
And so I think the best compromise here is the most common use case people are going to have is likely you've got a string that's less than 2 billion characters and therefore will fit in span, and you are likely working and using with span anyways. in which case the memory marshal create span from null terminated will be sufficient and avoids you needing to deal with casting and all the other checks that the get string length would yourself. And then we can revisit if we get a native or long span in the future, which I still think we should have.
So keep the memory marshal one, rename it to create from, and then kill the second part of the API set that was hanging off a buffer that gets string length APIs.
Yeah.
So all you get is the span. Sure. And it would just be an overload of create span.
Yeah, and I mean, Steve had the what else would the thing that just takes the pointer do, and while I don't have an easy answer for that off the top of my head, it's also not like something that I look at and immediately jump to the conclusion of what it's doing. It's not that I produce 2 answers for what it could be doing, it's I produce 0 answers for what it could be doing. In particular, the one that's byte star. And I think that's why we ended up naming it.
About strings constructors?
I think string taking a char star, I understand what that means. Like I understand when I see char star that means null terminated string. It's the byte star that throws me off, expecting a 0.
String also has a constructor that takes an S byte star.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a weird overload. But yes, you're right. The constructor that takes an S byte star reinterprets it as a byte star and then runs it through encoding.
Yeah, but you do have string as a context in that case. Here you just have memory marshal create span and it takes a byte star, and it's like, okay, is that create a page, create from here to the end of the page, create until you find a 0 or until you find a 255 or?
Well, you said.
For char star, it feels obvious to me, and then I can see the byte star being an overload of char star, but if I just saw the byte star first, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah, the byte stars for working with ASCII, ANSI, UTF-8, some kind of data that you're going to interpret later.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why
it's weird if it's just called memory marshal.create span from a byte pointer. That's not obvious that it's supposed to be a null terminated string.
No, I agree.
And I think that's why we ended up with the complicated name before, and it's great. It's a slightly ugly name, but it certainly tells you what it's doing.
Then there's a question of, there's already a create span. Does the char star have greater affinity to that one or to the byte star one?
Sorry? What do you mean by affinity?
Which name is it closer to? Like there's already an API called create span that takes that produces a span from
a ref and a length
pointer-like input. We're talking about adding 2 overloads here, one that takes a char star, one that takes a byte star. We just said if we didn't have the byte star one, folks seem to know what that means, and it would make sense to call it create span. But with the byte star one, now, do you still call the char star one create span, or do you call it the same thing that you call the byte star one?
Got it. Yeah.
It's weird no matter what we do, in my opinion.
Because of the existence of the byte star one. Yeah.
I think just create span from null terminated makes sense for either. It makes it very clear that we're searching for null termination and returning a span of that length.
Yep.
What does null termination mean? We have a very specific meaning of null termination for byte in the byte star case. It's 1 0 byte.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
is that necessarily true?
Yes.
That it's ASCII or UTF-8 data is the interpretation.
But if it was like UTF-16, that wouldn't necessarily be true, correct?
Well,
it would be two bytes adjacent, 2 null bytes adjacent to each other.
Right.
Well,
so
it would return it would actually, if you have English text, it would return after the first letter because you would get or before the first letter, wherever the high half of the.
If you have a UTF-16 piece of text and you've reinterpret cast it as a byte star, and then you try looking for the null termination over the byte star, it will terminate after the first letter, yes.
Not even talking about reinterpretation, just p invokes, right? If you were using char star on the native side and you interpreted that as byte star on the managed side or whatever. Like, my point being, we have to be extremely clear what we mean by byte here, because only two meanings of it are valid. Every other meaning is possibly invalid.
So you're suggesting create from UTF-16 and create from UTF-8, null terminated.
Maybe.
But it's
or maybe
not
name...
UTF-16 and UTF-8. It's literally it's literally any buffer. It's just the canonical use case is you're going to somehow interpret it as text.
Well,
Right.
but I mean,
It's the null. I think it's the null termination in the byte case. It's like, what does null termination mean? Basically it's search for the first zero.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
my general interpretation would be, because it's a pointer, you would just say the last element is still the same size as the type to the pointer, and that one is looked for all zeros, which means in the char star case, you look for 2 0 bytes. In the byte star case, you look for 1 0 byte. That to me makes intuitive sense.
so I think that we're exclusive on that byte. So it's not part of your span. The span terminated right before it.
Right, but that's also kind of...
That's how all of our other span APIs work.
I mean, that's kind of how... I mean, I can see this being confusing if you also mix it with native memory allocations, because then you're off by 1, but I mean...
Right, you said that the last byte the last value has the right size, and it's the last value won't be 0. The value after the last value is 0.
I think it's okay to make an assumption here that if you're calling this, that you're familiar with what null terminated means, and you're probably p-invoking something.
Yeah.
You're either about to p-invoke or you've received this data from a p-invoke.
I mean, happy with
that's my point. That's the context I'm worried about. If I'm p-invoking to something that gives me back UTF-16 data, this will do the wrong thing.
If you're taking a UTF-16 string and you're not returning it as either short, ushort, or char, then you're doing it wrong.
Why? Why can't people treat things as bytes all the time? We have APIs that let you treat things as bytes regardless of what they are.
We do, but that's generally not how interop is done in .NET though, right? Like if you're intending to interop UTF-16 string data, then generally it goes as a char star, not a byte star. And if it has to go as something else, that's what the marshalize attribute is for.
In Win32, 80% of the time it's LP void. So.
True.
And if you're reinterpreting it as byte and calling this, then you're already in a advanced scenario where you should know what APIs you're doing, because you're in super unsafe land already.
I'm happy with create span from UTF-8 and create span from UTF-16, and yes, the UTF-8 one also works with ASCII, but like the 40 people who need to care already know that.
I wouldn't even do the UTF-16 one. I'm suggesting maybe, I mean, elsewhere, when we take byte stars, don't we talk about them in terms of UTF-8?
You mean name the parameter UTF-8 data rather than value?
Either that or yeah, sure.
If the data is intended to be interpreted as UTF-8, then the parameter name or the method name should state such, because otherwise it's literally just a binary buffer.
I mean, you don't really care about UTF-8 here either, right? You're just saying you can't have null terminated before the end, right? Which
it semantically matches the UTF-8 string implicit terminator.
Yeah.
I mean, my only question is if you say create from null terminated UTF-8 or something, that to me implies you validated as actually valid UTF-8, which you wouldn't, right? It would just say, well, if you give me something that's not UTF-8, then it might contain 0 bytes somewhere, and then you're maybe out of luck. But
I'm not too worried about validation here because we don't validate for char star. Rather, we wouldn't validate for char star.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's why it seems weird to me.
I think we're not going to find a good solution no matter which way we look at it. Either we're lying about it, strictly speaking, being UTF-8 data, or we're going to come up with some crazy complicated name that satisfies the fact that it's arbitrary data and only interpreting it as bytes rather than as char. And I think given the advanced scenario and everything else, I'm not sure that those are really concerns that should exist here.
So I think if we went and played back the previous video, I think we're just rehashing the Well, let's put UTF-8. Well, it's not necessarily UTF-8. Well, what if it's not well formed? Well, all we care is it's 0, and that's why we ended up with create from null terminated. It was the answer that, while nobody liked, nobody could really disagree with it.
So an alternative, and maybe this satisfies one of your earlier concerns, Steve. What if we had an API that, given a char star or a byte star, returns the char star or the byte star of where the null terminator is? Like, it takes a pointer and it returns a pointer, and it's up to you, the caller, to do subtraction.
The warm feeling of C++.
I think that's also the same issue of, do you interpret the byte as UTF-8 or UTF-16 when you also see the char?
Because that would be what, like memory marshal dot find 0 of char star?
I mean, it's literally, I'm totally fine with calling this memory marshal dot Sterlin and memory marshal dot WCSLin. Like, seriously, I'm fine with using those names because that's literally what this method is.
But the links don't return the pointers.
But yeah.
I mean, if you're returning the pointer of where the null is, that's not Sterlin.
So
we can't
think
use WCSLN because WCHAR is 2 or 4 bytes depending on what OS you're on.
Sure.
I feel like I'm aligning with Tanner. I feel like this solution here is sufficiently advanced that it's okay to rely on byte and char and trust the developer to know what that means.
So it sounds like we're congregating around keep the first half of the APIs as is, nix the second half.
Yeah, I think somebody suggested putting span between create and from, but yeah.
Create span from makes sense. I mean, it matches a create span. Well, we have create from pinned array, but that's create memory, so never mind. Yeah. I'm fine with create span from null terminated. It's just wordy.
All right, and we're then deciding to punt on get string length instead of make it return int.
Right.
I feel that's the right choice for that API.
If we're returning a span, have we decided what happens if you happen to be scanning over more than 2 gigs of data?
It would have to return an argument exception probably, or an overflow exception, one of the two.
Or we could document it to return the original. We could document it to return default span in that case, or something like that. But yeah, I think argument's probably the best.
Yeah, throwing seems the best.
Don't we support span being bigger than array?
Yes, but only up to int.max value.
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason, I thought that span did support full memory, even in a.
Its internal field is a proper native integer, but we only allow it up to int.max value, which is too late to fix.
Yeah, there is a separate work item, by the way, and this is what Steve and others alluded to earlier in the conversation about there is consideration for a native span that would have a new int for a length. Once that comes online, if that comes online, we're going to have to update a whole slew of methods in the framework, including this one. But that's a bridge we can cross when we get to it.
Fair enough. So yeah, I mean, I guess yes, it'll need a behavior, which is probably invalid operation exception.
So maybe I'm missing the. So what is the error condition maybe throw?
The error condition here is if we get through 2 billion bytes or 2 billion characters and still haven't found a null terminator, at that point we can't return a span to you. So we throw an exception.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it either artificially caps it at int.max value, or it returns default, or it throws. And
Yeah, I don't think it should artificially cap without the caller explicitly requesting a cap.
Yeah, so
I also expect in the 99.999% case we will AV before then.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, my guess would be invalid operation exception. It's not super common. Somebody should get it. It's not. I mean, it is sort of an argument problem, but it's not something they could pre-validate. But it feels like the method got into a state that it just can't continue, which is invalid operation.
That's also fine. Yeah. I'm not too married to any particular exception type.
And then name and signature stay the same?
Maybe we change the name to create span from rather than just create from, but that's, I don't know. I don't feel strongly.
We already have a create from pinned array.
That creates a memory, not a span.
Interesting.
But yes, we do have a create from.
Then I think probably adding span in the middle is probably a good idea, because then they also appear more close to each other.
Well, and that would also make it easier to expose create native span from if we expose native span in the future.
True.
And then I assume we would have create span and create read-only span, right? Or do we only have one of them?
I think just create span sufficient, because span is implicitly convertible, except in F# to read-only span.
So that means we should return span, not read-only span.
Correct.
Yeah. Why do we have create read-only span? It doesn't say it takes a read-only ref or anything. It just like it's the same signature as create span, but different return value.
I think it was to make the JIT happier, because then it didn't need to do the implicit conversion from span to read-only span before calling helper functions.
Well, it's also to make everybody's life easier who, because if you need to a local variable of the other type, you either have to declare the type if you don't want to use var, or you have to cast, but either way you now have to say the type multiple times.
Yeah.
Versus just adding
there are benefits to it.
It's the question is just, is there a reason we are willing, like what's the reason that we said we needed create read-only span, but we're saying like shrug, let the implicit conversion happen for this one? Is it just we think that this is super much rarer than creating it from a FT?
I think create read-only span was done as a performance optimization, because I think at the time it was created, the JIT didn't properly optimize conversions from span to read-only span. But that's, I'm reaching like deep into the annals of my memory here, so don't quote me on that. In fact, scrub this entire video.
I think the only other consideration might have been F#, and whether given you have to explicitly cast for that scenario.
Yeah. Does anybody know how common it is to play with pointers in F#?
They support them.
Yeah, they support them.
Yeah. I mean, given that it's easier to add than remove, only adding the writable span version right now seems fine. I'm just making sure that we're not missing something obvious.
We have an entire year to come back and fix that.
We have like 11 months, but yeah.
Right, so that means we would not add the read-only. We can still add the read-only one later if there's a need for it. I suspect regardless of perf, I think there's usability reasons why somebody might want this, but this is not an API where that's probably the number one problem.
I was trying to make this easy for everyone. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm actually happy that use was last. It's all good.
All these problems would go away if we would just embrace and Intinuent.
Or we could just stop reviewing APIs.
Well, if you stop reviewing my APIs, half of your problems just go away right there.
All right, so I think then we have all the nodes. Let me mark the API as approved. All right, read my commentary and make sure that you agree with it. I didn't miss something.
Can you post your comment into chat?
I cannot, quite literally, because every time
it's on the issue right now.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yes, that looks correct.
Yep.
Awesome. Then this is it for today, and then I see you guys next week where we do another iteration of the release JSON APIs. All right.
Fun times.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.